Hi, I'm Sherry with Whole Circle Studio and welcome to week 6 of the Leaf Peepers quilt along. So I have my quilts all basted. I have two versions actually, my square version all basted and my table runner. And I'm going to start digging in and quilting my square version. So let me show you some of the things I do to prepare for this. We're going to first start quilting block 1, the leaf of block 1, but before I do that I want to pick out my thread. So I went ahead and I'm actually going to be quilting the whole quilt with this selection of thread. I'm using a 50 weight cotton and I really like the Aurifil brand. And I really love to match my thread colors to the fabric that I'm quilting. So I went ahead, like I said, and picked out colors that would correspond well. For leaf 1, I have this lovely green selection. And then one of these colors, just like with the fabric, this color will actually carry over and I'll use in leaf 2 as well. And I really like to match my colors because I feel like the thread, then the quilting will support the quilt top versus working against it. The other really great thing is if I quilt the same colors, it blends in a little bit and any imperfections to my quilting will just kind of melt away, which is really, really nice. So that's my little trick. So you can see here when I open them up, they're pretty close matches. Sometimes I don't match as closely, but for this one I am. I'm going to be using my walking foot to quilt. That's what I'm really comfortable with and I love the results. And because these leaves are pretty small, I'm going to use a 2.5 millimeter thread length, stitch length on my machine. I typically go anywhere between 2 millimeters and sometimes 3 millimeters. It's just a matter of personal taste. What I'm also going to do, and something that I do often, is let the seams of my quilt top inform how it should be or how I want it to be quilted. I'm going to start very close to the middle of my quilt, so I think I'm going to start right around here, and I'm just going to follow my seams and then follow those quilted lines, and I'll show you what I mean by that when we hop over to the machine. Another strategy, if you're not quite sure how to quilt it, I like to use tracing paper, and I'll just put the tracing paper over top and then just doodle and sketch, and it could be organic lines, or if I'm going to go with straight lines, I'll just put my ruler down and I'll draw lines, and then I'll draw all over it, kind of see what I like. If I don't like it, I'll rip it off, start over again, and that's sort of a really good guide to get started. Now we're over on the machine and I'm ready to start quilting. I changed out my needle, so I have a nice fresh sharp needle, and I threaded my machine with my first color that will match the fabric that I'm going to start with. I have, you'll see, a long tail both for my top thread and my bottom thread. That's because we're going to pull it up, I'll show you that in a minute, and bury the thread when we're done. So let's get started. I'm going to start by just following my seam line between the leaf and the white line. This pin is in my way, so I'm going to take it out. I'm going to use my quick clip, which saves on my fingers, to take that out and get it out of there. And I'm just going to start right on the tip. And I like to quilt to the edge of my ditch, so you've probably heard of stitching in the ditch, which means stitching right in the seam. I'm not that good. I am a pretty messy stitch in the ditcher, so my solution is to stitch just to the side of the ditch. So you'll see I'm going to go all around this first shape, stopping when I come to a pin. And again, my stitch length is set to a 2.5, and I'm just going to follow right to the side of the ditch. And again, slow down when I come to a pin. Use my clip. And when I come to a point, I'm going to make sure my needle is down and pivot. And then just continue on. When I get close to where I started and I have this loose thread, I'm going to use a needle, or I have this soft touch thread pick, and I'm just going to tug slightly on the thread and pull the bobbin thread up. And this, by doing this, it'll keep me from running over that bottom thread with my machine, and then at the end I'm going to bury that thread. But I'm just going to let it be for now off to the side, and I'll show you how to bury those threads shortly. I'm just going to continue to where I started, where that first stitch was. Okay, so I could stop there. But what I'm going to do is travel up to where I want my next line to be. So I'm just going to rotate the quilt so that you could see better. What I want to do now is I'm going to do another line that is parallel to what I just quilted, so parallel to the seam. And I'm going to use the line that I just quilted as a guide. And so I want to travel up. I know, because I've measured, that between my needle and this edge of my walking foot is about 3/8 of an inch. So what I like to do, so that I know how far up to travel, is that I'll take my ruler and I'll measure up 3/8 of an inch. And I'm going to stick a little pin, a straight pin in there as a guide. I'm now going to stitch up along that seam, or just to the left of the seam, until I get close to that pin. Be very careful not to run the pin over, and that way I know it's 3/8 of an inch. So when I rotate it, my foot should be pretty close to that 3/8. It's a little bit off, so if I wanted to be really more accurate, I'll maybe do another stitch. There we go. And now you can see that the foot, my walking foot, is aligned right about with that seam, and I can use it as a guide. So now I'm just going to use, like I said, that seam, that stitch as a guide, and just follow it along to get a perfectly straight stitch. And when I get close to the edge, I can eyeball it where I need to pivot, or again, I can use my ruler and measure about 3/8 of an inch. Your walking foot distance between your needle and the edge of your walking foot might be different, so I recommend, to get that distance, to just measure it when the needle is down, from the center of the needle to the edge of the foot. Strangely enough, from the needle to this side is only 1/2 an inch. So I know, depending on what side I'm measuring, I'm using as a guide, I need to measure. So I'll pivot. And again, I can eyeball it, or I can just measure 3/8 of an inch and use my pin as a guide. Or an approximate guide, I should say. And we'll just rotate this around. And it looks like I did pretty good. That previous quilted line is matching up with the edge of my walking foot. And I'll just follow that along. For that diagonal right there, I know if I just hit the middle of that seam that it should line right up, and it does. So that's why I didn't measure that one. So I am pretty happy with that quilting density. I think I'm going to leave it for now. I can always come back and add additional quilted lines, but I'm liking the way that looks. So I'm going to end my thread here so that I can move on to the next section since I'm changing thread colors. If you're not, and you were using this same thread color in this space, you could just travel right on up and start quilting in that area. But I'm going to end it. So I'm going to move my needle up and I'm going to pull out my threads gently. I'm going to give myself a little bit of room and cut it here. And then you won't be able to see this, but I'm going to go underneath and cut the bobbin thread. And then let me show you what to do with these threads. So just like I did the first one, I'm going to use my thread pick, or I can do this with just a plain old needle. And I'm going to just pull it a little bit, the top thread, and gently bring the bobbin thread up. So I have both threads to the top. And then next what I'm going to do is I have an easy thread needle. They're also called cheater needles. They have a little groove in the top, so you can actually take your threads and kind of just snap them through and they'll hold temporarily versus having to thread a needle hole. So that's what a cheater needle is, or an easy thread needle. I like to put my thread between two fingers and make a knot. However you can make a knot is fine. So I have my loop, and then I'm just going to put my needle in between that loop to give me a little bit of leverage. I'm going to pull the thread until I have a little knot that'll sit right at the top. I'll then take my needle and thread it. And then I'm going to go, and in one of the holes that thread is just coming up through, I'm going to put my needle in. I'm going to make sure I'm feeling below to make sure that the needle isn't through the back. The needle is between the batting and the top of my quilt. And this is where you're going to hide your thread tail. So I confirmed that my needle's not on the back. I can always flip it over. Sometimes it's easier not to do this away from your machine. And then I'm just going to take my needle and pull, and I'll feel or hear a little bit of a pop of that knot that I made underneath the quilt top. So I felt it and I heard it. I'm going to pull the thread, and then I'm just going to take my scissors and very carefully I'm going to trim it right at the top of the quilt top. And now my thread is buried. And I'm going to do the same thing for this one. And then I'm going to continue on and do the same sort of technique of following my seams and then following what I just quilted throughout this whole leaf. And I'll show you that in a little bit. I finished quilting my first leaf using a 3/8 of an inch width between all of the lines. Again, using the seam as my first guide all the way around the shape, and then using the quilted line as a guide for the next line. I'm not quite sure. I may go back and add in some quilting lines between them, but for now I'm going to leave it as is, and I'm going to move on to block number 2. I hope you're enjoying quilting your first block, and I'll see you next week. Let's make something awesome.